Good evening. CrossCurrents is produced by the City of Fort Collins in cooperation with the Larimer County League of Women Voters. I'm Mary Dietrich, the moderator for today's program. $25, disease-free, someone to meet you. Almost 100 years ago, my grandfather left Yugoslavia and political turmoil to arrive in New York. He met the requirements for entry. No visa, you're here, good luck. Several years later, my mother left Czechoslovakia with the same goals. But that wasn't true for everyone. In 1790, as early as 1790, immigration to the United States was limited to those of European or Caucasian descent. In 1882, Chinese were especially excluded in order to protect the good order, until 1943 when that was repealed. Between 1872 and 1890, Congress restricted immigration based on moral grounds, including prostitutes, criminals, the mentally ill, and those financially unable. 1885 and 1887 saw laws based on labor and economic reasons. In the 1920s, residents from Southern and Eastern Europe, like my grandparents, were added to the restricted list. If my grandparents had tried to enter just 20 years later, they would have been turned away. Later, most Asians were banned, and Mexican entry was made more difficult. While we are without doubt a nation of immigrants, we are also a nation that often fears and denigrates the most recent immigrants and refugees. From the Irish fleeing the potato famine, to Jews fleeing Nazi Germany, to the Vietnamese boat people, those who came to escape conflict and famine frequently faced hostility and discrimination from previous immigrants concerned about disease, lawlessness, and job security. There were even pseudo-scientific ideas about racial superiority or being better suited to become Americans. Today, about 4% of U.S. residents are termed undocumented, having entered the country without a visa or continuing to live here after a visa has expired. While many groups of new immigrants still face fear and harassment, this situation seems to have become more divisive for this undocumented group. Recently, a group of Fort Collins residents and organizations asked our City Council to consider an ordinance called Strengthening Community Trust in response to a perceived increase in fear and harassment because of national rhetoric and changes in policy enforcement. Tonight's program is an attempt to discuss the situation facing these residents to our city and whether or not the city should formalize a policy that will increase trust so that our undocumented immigrant community feels more secure in working with police and other city services. This is an issue that many cities and states across the country are dealing with. More than 25 cities have adopted similar policies, and probably just as many have adopted policies in the opposite direction. The League of Women Voters is committed to programs such as this that educate residents about issues they will soon face so that they can become educated, involved, participants in discussions and decisions. Thank you for joining us this evening. At the far end of the table, let me start introducing our panel. First, we have Glenn Colton, an activist citizen here in Fort Collins. Next to Glenn is Kim Baker Medina, an immigration attorney. Philip Cafaro joins us as a professor from Colorado State University. And then we have another professor from CSU, Ernesto Sagas. Welcome to you and to our studio and viewing audience. About halfway through, we'll invite our studio audience to ask questions of the panel about the information that's been presented. I think it would be helpful for our audience if we started out with just some basic information about who these people are, how many there are, and why they're here. Who'd like to throw in some information? Kim?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start, Mary. And, I think migration, human migration, is one of the most natural human activities. And we need to be really clear, we're talking here about migration, which is the movement of human beings across the planet, not population, which has to do with an increase in human beings on the planet. And people immigrate to the United States for a lot of reasons. People come to be with family, they come for work, they come because they're fleeing persecution, political turmoil, like your family. Sometimes they are pushed out of their country by things like crime, violence, persecution, bad economy, and sometimes they're pulled into this country by family ties or for jobs, or perhaps because they value our political freedom or values. There are a lot of reasons that people come. I think one of the most important things to get out there before we start talking about things that relate to immigrants and immigration is I often hear conversations start with, well, why don't people just come legally? Why don't they just get in line?
I think that's a great question.
I think it's a great question, and I think that what most of us in this country don't realize, and we need to educate ourselves on this before we have the conversation, is that for most people, there is no line. That is that you cannot legally immigrate to the United States for a better way of life. You cannot legally immigrate to the United States because you want a better future for yourself and your children. That's not a legal way to immigrate to the United States. So the first thing is that for most people, there is no line to get into. Very limited. Very limited categories of workers, very limited categories of family members. The second thing is that when people do get in line, those lines are very, very long. So, for example, if you're immigrating on the basis of a family petition and you're from Mexico, you might have been waiting since 1996. If you're from the Philippines, you've been waiting since 1994. So those are the kinds of lines that we have for people to get into.
Okay, Phil?
Yeah, I think it's important to put this in a little bit of context. The United States has the most generous immigration policy in the world. We take in about 3 times as many people annually on a year in and year out basis, 3 times more than the nearest country after that. So we have a very generous immigration policy. We bring in people under many different categories, but there are many, many tens and even hundreds of millions of people who would like to come here. And that would simply be unworkable. So there are lines, and there are also people who choose to ignore our laws, break our laws, and there are people who encourage them to do that. And that's what this ordinance is about.
Okay. Ernesto, you came here as a young child?
Yep.
No, you were born here.
I was born here.
You were
My
born
parents
here.
were exiles. One of the many reasons why people come to the United States. I happen to be just 90 miles away from the United States, and they ended up here. But let me say something. Migration is one of the oldest human social phenomena. We're all migrants. We all came out of Africa over millennia, and we have made it to pretty much every continent, and eventually at some point we're going to make it to outer space. So essentially, what we're looking is a very social human phenomena, okay? And we are trying to legislate ways to channel it, but essentially human beings will migrate regardless.
Very, very difficult. Glenn, you need to throw something in there, I think.
Yeah, you gave a quite lengthy explanation of some of our historical background on immigration, but along with being a nation of immigrants, we're a nation of laws. And I think that's very important in discussion of this ordinance tonight. And I'd like to clarify that these people really aren't undocumented. The correct terminology is illegal aliens, and that's because they're from a foreign country and they're here illegally. So I'm going to use the term illegal immigrant to soften it a little bit. But undocumented just kind of is one of those ways that people get around the fact of what is really occurring, and it shouldn't be encouraged.
Okay.
If I may, I don't want to get off on a tangent, but I would, if we could just refrain from talking about sort of these people and illegal aliens and things like that. I mean, I think we need to realize that when we're having this conversation, we are talking about members of our communities, members of our families, our friends, our children's friends, our neighbors, and our coworkers. And so I think we really, any sort of attempt to dehumanize the immigrant population, I think delegitimizes this conversation. So I really just want to keep it away from sort of these people, and let's talk about the ordinance. Like, let's talk about people who are here. Let's talk about the fact that over 57% of immigrants in the United States have been here before the year 2000. So been here for over 17 years. very, very integrated into our community, participating in our community, and at this particular point in our history, living with a level of fear that is completely unprecedented. And so I think I'd like to kind of bring it back to the ordinance, talk about our community and people in our community.
Okay, I'm going to let Phil have a real quick
Well, as
remark
long as we're talking about members of our community, I'd like to make 2 points about that. First, I don't accept illegal immigrants as members of my Fort Collins community. I mean, we're talking about people who are here illegally, breaking the law, taking jobs that they're not entitled to. So really, the main question that this ordinance brings up is, do we want to normalize illegal immigration? And talking about people as members of our community is a good rhetorical way to do that. But the second point I want to bring up is, okay, we want to talk about members of our community. Let's talk about working class members of the Fort Collins community. Let's talk about people working in landscaping. Let's talk about our citizens who are working as dishwashers. Let's talk about fellow citizens working in construction. If we're going to be concerned about community members, I think it's time for us to be concerned about them and to be concerned about flooding labor markets.
Okay, let's go back to the ordinance.
May I clarify something? There's no such a thing as illegal immigration. Actually, most of the people that are in the United States enter the United States legally. The preferred term is actually unauthorized. So those people that you're describing as having committed an illegal action, actually they are now without authorization in the United States.
That's not my preferred term.
Okay, well, let's talk about the ordinance. Let's start with Kim, if you could very quickly talk about whose idea was this to introduce this ordinance to the city?
So the proposed ordinance came about because following the presidential election, and when I say we, I mean not just me as an immigration attorney, and I can talk about what I see in my office, but members of the community. So in not just in my immigration practice, but people in schools, people in the community, people in nonprofits, people that work in the health sector, all began to see a level of fear in immigrant families and children of immigrants that was absolutely unprecedented and absolutely paralyzing. And so that people were no longer reporting crimes. People were fearful of taking their children to school. People stopped signing their kids up for school lunch programs or backpacks. People were not taking their U.S. citizen children who maybe needed some sort of a therapy or services for disabled children, taking them in for those services. An entire segment of our community became practically paralyzed. And so we started talking about what was going on, and people were living in fear. And we were hearing from schools that children are crying, and children are not sleeping, and children are not knowing if mommy and daddy is coming home at night. And this is really coming from not just from rhetoric at the national level, but also from increased actions at the federal level, so increased immigration enforcement. So we started talking about, not about changing immigration laws, not about changing immigration enforcement. We started talking about what can we do as a community, and who are we as a community? Are we a community where a large segment of our children are afraid every single day that mommy or daddy is not going to come home? Is that the community we are? Are we a community where our neighbors won't call the police if they're a victim of a crime or if they're a witness to a crime? Or are we a community where we encourage everyone, regardless of immigration status? Because I really would like to stress that we are talking about human beings. We're not talking about some sort of object here. So everybody who's a member of our community is fully participating. And so that's where the idea of the ordinance came about. The ordinance does not...
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you come here without proper authorization, illegally, however you want to phrase it, you are legally not permitted to work, although we know that many of them do work. You're not legally permitted to vote. But what rights do you have as a person from another country who is not a citizen?
So everyone, regardless of immigration status, has constitutional protections. So the Constitution does apply to everyone. And so people do have constitutional rights. And I think I would argue that people also have a right to live to decency, to self-respect, to live without hate, to live without rhetoric that dehumanizes them, and to fully participate in their community.
Phil?
Yeah, all of that sounds great, but there are other questions involved here too. I mean, there's the question of whether, as we live in a community, are we going to come together, make laws, make rules, make policy that we're not going to agree on it, right? I mean, Kim and I are not going to agree on what the proper level of immigration is into the United States. But at the end of the day, we're supposed to play by the rules. And whatever that level is, you know, I'm not allowed to discriminate or discriminate in housing or employment against immigrants, for instance. But on the other side, she really shouldn't be allowed to encourage illegal immigration. She should play by the rules as well. And when you frame it in a different way, I mean, because basically what this ordinance is doing is saying, if you can get to Fort Collins, you are a member of our community. There's no limit in here. Anybody who's a resident, which I take to mean you've been here for a day and a half, you are entitled to anything that a citizen is entitled to. Now, that's not what the people of this country want. That's not what the people of Fort Collins want.
Well, I think that's a very good question that I would ask, is that what the people of Fort Collins want? And that's kind of one of the questions behind this ordinance is, but, you know, I know that students go to school. They have every right to go to school. They have every right to feel safe in school. So, you know, there's a fine line in many directions. Ernesto?
Yeah, I mean, this goes beyond the legal question. This is more of a civic question. What kind of community do we want to be? Do we want to be a welcoming community that respects people's humanity, or do we want to be a community where some people have to live in fear? And it's not about attracting people. We're talking about the people that are already here. What kind of life do we want for our whole community? And that means everyone in Fort Collins.
Glenn?
You know, Fort Collins existed by itself, and we had, say, 5,000 illegal immigrants. I don't know how many we have, and no more can move in. You know, maybe we'd look at it one way, but it's very true that this is akin to a sanctuary city policy, and it tells people once you get here, unless you do something like a felony or something to attract ICE's attention, you can just coast along and not have to worry, and you get all the same rights and benefits and services as all the citizens of the United States and all those legal immigrants who spent all the time and effort to come here legally. I think by blurring that line between legal and illegal immigration, you're really destroying trust right there. Because one of the things that we rely on as a community, again, is the rule of law, and that our laws will be enforced, and that certain people just aren't treated specially, and the laws don't apply to them, as this ordinance is trying to make happen.
Okay, Ernesto, then Kim.
No one is blurring any lines. I mean, these people are still unauthorized in the United States. Essentially, what we're talking about is about people not having to live in fear. Also, there's no evidence whatsoever beyond anecdotal evidence that these kinds of laws are drawing people to a particular city. What draws people to a particular city is, number one, jobs, number two, social networks.
And that was one of my questions. Is there data that says that, I mean, we have some fairly large cities in this country that are...
There's very good data that
Kim was
when Arizona passed some pretty strict immigration laws several years ago, there was a large outflux of immigrants. Something similar happened in Alabama. There is very good evidence that when you encourage illegal immigration, people are going to take advantage of that.
Kim?
Thanks, Mary. And we're talking about the ordinance sort of in the abstract without talking about what the ordinance really does. So if I could just spend a second, let's just talk about what the ordinance does and does not do. Okay? So the proposed ordinance says that it prohibits discrimination on the basis of immigration status. It states that city employees shall not inquire about immigration status unless required by state or federal law, so that it does not conflict with any state or federal law. And what it doesn't do is it does not confer any special benefit or privilege. It does not impede or alter or affect in any way the federal government's ability to enforce immigration laws. It does not provide immigrants with any sort of sanctuary or protection or special status. What it does do is it sends a very clear message that in the city of Fort Collins, we want you, if you are living here, to fully participate in our community, regardless of your immigration status, just like we want you to fully participate, regardless of your race, regardless of your religion, regardless of your sexual orientation, regardless of your nationality, and regardless of your immigration status. We want you to be a full participant, and we want you to feel safe in our community. And that's what it does. And what it will do, actually, if I may, I spend every day of my life working with immigrants, including people who are undocumented. And the stories that you hear are frightening, and they're frightening because it affects all of us. If my neighbor doesn't call the police after her 13-year-old daughter is sexually assaulted, that affects me because the perpetrator of that crime is out in the community. And why is he out in the community? Because she's afraid that if she calls the police, that she will be deported. So what I want to tell that neighbor of mine is contact the police, contact the city, seek help. That makes us all safer, Mary. That's what this is all about.
I think Kim put her finger on what this is all about. She said, and it's true, in Fort Collins under Chapter 13 on human relations, Article 2, you have a very strong statement against discrimination in employment. You have a very strong statement against discrimination in housing on the basis of race, sexual orientation, ethnic group, et cetera, et cetera. And that's in there because we as a community believe people have a right to fair housing and fair employment, and they have a right against discrimination on those bases. What this ordinance seeks to do, and it has some very convoluted legal language in there because you really can't do it because it would conflict with federal law. But what it tries to do is say, now we're going to say discrimination on the basis of being in the country illegally is just as bad. And I just don't buy it. I think we want to discriminate against people who are in the country illegally. We want to discriminate against them, find out that they're here, and send them back.
Nesta?
Again, just because something is legal, it doesn't mean it's right. Okay? Slavery was legal. Denying women the right to vote was legal. Essentially, what we're talking about, again, is a moral issue. Do people have to live in fear, or are they going to feel welcome in this city? It's essentially this kind of attitudes that divide our community instead of uniting them.
Okay, Glenn.
Just a couple of points. All the people that are here living in fear came here by their own volition and are violating the law of their own volition. And they have the choice to move back to their home country or move to a sanctuary city where they feel like they should get all of the services to someone else. I mean, they caused their own plight. But on top of that, we already have rules against racial profiling, and it's police policy that if a victim comes forward and they're an illegal immigrant, that they do not prosecute that victim. They will go after the violator. But why would we tie the hands of our law enforcement officials? In the example Kim came where someone was sexually assaulted. If that was an illegal immigrant that did that, but you couldn't prove it, wouldn't you want your law enforcement officials to be able to go and say, you're here illegally and we're going to turn you over to ICE and get rid of that problem instead of waiting until he does it again? I mean, this is unnecessarily tying the hands of law enforcement to keep our communities safe. And I don't feel safer when our police officers cannot address gang activity, assaults, drug traffic, and things like that with all the tools available to them.
Okay, well, I'll have to turn this over to Kim and say specifically, what happens if someone is involved in a criminal act? Is there anything in this ordinance that would prevent the police from discussing immigration status?
Absolutely not, Mary. This ordinance has absolutely no effect on the federal government's ability to enforce immigration laws. And let me just use the example. Let's say that someone who commits a crime is caught by the police. They're taken to the Laramie County Detention Center, their prints are run, and immigration is contacted. This ordinance has nothing to do with that. None of the community trust ordinances that have passed in hundreds of cities throughout the United States are doing that. These are about community trust. This is about making our community a place where everybody feels safe to report crimes to law enforcement. That's what it's about. And I want to just really quickly talk.
Let me just ask real quickly. Is there anything going on in the city now that precludes this? Is the city routinely asking about immigration status? Do the police ask about it? Is this just codifying practices that are now in effect, or is it attempting to change practice?
So a lot of people in the city are not asking about immigration status. And one of the things that the city is doing, to their credit, is they're looking at all of their different programs and saying, are there situations where we're asking for immigration status, or maybe where it's not required by state or federal law? So we want to make sure that we're just doing that when it's required by state or federal law. When it comes to law enforcement, that's a difficult question. And one of the beauties of legislation is that when you're dealing with anyone, in any sort of basket, there's a lot of good apples, and sometimes there's one who's not as good. And so when you have something like an ordinance or legislation, then you make sure that everybody in that basket is following the same rules. So it could be that we have a lot of good law enforcement who are encouraging victims and witnesses to come forward. It could be we have some who are, in fact, discouraging people to come forward. But regardless, we have a community with a widespread perception that it is not safe to contact law enforcement. And, for example, as an immigration attorney, I show up at work one morning and I get a call from one of my clients who says, last night they broke into my truck and stole $4,000 worth of my work tools. Can I call the police? Why is he asking his immigration attorney that question? That shouldn't even cross his mind. Of course he should call the police. The same with a client whose daughter was sexually assaulted. Why would you not call the police? Why not? Because I'm afraid if I call the police that they will contact immigration. Okay. And so it's really important that these people feel safe in reporting crimes.
Okay, let me throw out a general question for everybody. You're in a situation where you are the victim of a crime, and a person comes up to you and says, I saw the crime. And you say, well, come with me to the police and issue a report. Do you want that person to feel comfortable doing that even though they are undocumented / illegal? Would that be to your benefit? Let's start with...
By all means. We even have criminals serving as witnesses. That's why we have a witness protection program. So the legal status of a person should not be in any way an impediment for that person helping to solve a crime.
And so,
fear
Phil,
should not cross that person's mind.
if you're the victim of that crime, do you want that person to feel comfortable coming forward and giving testimony about your assault?
I do, but I also, if someone has taken my job, or...
No, stay focused on the question I asked. We'll come to that question later.
Well, I'm not sure we ever will. I mean, we're hearing a lot of stories about this community that's very fearful, and you can sort of pick different ways in which it definitely makes sense to try to help them or to integrate them into our community. But look at what's causing this situation. We've had 4 or 5 decades, really, of the federal government punting on enforcing our immigration laws. And that's driven primarily by the fact that big business wants cheap labor, okay? So we've reached a point where there are 10 to 12 million illegal immigrants in the country. And so now it's very difficult to know how to handle that. But I don't accept the answer that's given by this ordinance, which is throw the gates open, and then we'll wind up with 20 or 30 million illegal immigrants. And how is that going to help us?
Well, I'm not sure this ordinance will throw the gates open. If right now there are 11 million immigrants, are the numbers going down?
Well,
of new illegal immigrants coming in?
They're staying relatively stable at the moment.
Okay. Glenn.
the numbers are relatively stable right now, but actually illegal immigration is going down now because there's actually been some effort into enforcing the law. So the fear factor does work in reducing illegal immigration. And some people are actually returning to their homes because the law is being enforced. So how can we effectively have a law if you get past the border or come in on a visa and then overstay that visa, and you get in the community, and effectively there is no one checking your immigration status, and you get all the rights, all the services, all the benefits of citizens and legal immigrants. You know, that is not trust. That is really breaking the trust of all of the legal, law-abiding citizens of this country. And I reject this ordinance because of that.
Okay, so you're saying that what I'm hearing, and give me some feedback on this, that immigration laws for several decades were not enforced. So these people, in effect, were encouraged to come here because the laws were not being enforced.
Oh, absolutely.
So some of them now have been in this country for as much as 20 years. They have become part of the community. Is there a way to find a compromise in this situation where we acknowledge that these people are here for more than a day and a half, and they are part of our community, and not wholly of their own making?
Absolutely. There's a way to do that, but it's not by pushing through an ordinance like this, which basically says to the majority of the people in our community, look, if you have a problem with illegal immigration, it's because you're a racist. Okay, that's not the way to a compromise.
Well,
you know what the way to a compromise is?
That's not even on the table in this discussion.
Well, but it is. I mean, if you look at the whereases in this, you get a real sense that the argument's being made that there's no good reason to limit immigration. So we could have a compromise on this year, I think. Glenn and I would have to accept an amnesty for people who are here illegally and who've been here for a long amount of time. And Ernesto and Kim and the people who wrote this ordinance would have to accept that it's okay to enforce immigration law, and they have to quit fighting that. That's the compromise.
May I chip in?
You may.
Mark Twain used to say that there are three kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. Okay? The 10 to 12 million figure for the undocumented has been tossed around, but it's, as the authorities will mention it in their official documents, it's just a guess estimate. Okay? Mm-hmm. There's no possible way to count those that don't want to be counted. Okay? Mm-hmm. The only accurate head count that we have is the decennial census, nothing else. Okay? Mm-hmm. Number two, again, there's no evidence that these kinds of laws attract people in any way. The evidence is that jobs and social networks is what attracts people. Those people are here because Colorado has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country. The recession is over. We know that the immigration trends based on the number of apprehensions, people going back to particularly Mexico, the largest source of the unauthorized in the United States. We know that actually there was a net flow of people going back to Mexico, and we know that actually it has kind of become stable since the Great Recession. Now, there's a housing boom going on, jobs are plentiful. Again, market forces, supply and demand are driving people to come to the United States, by all means, both legal and undocumented.
And Mary, I think it's important to talk about who in our community is affected by the fear that people are feeling right now. And I want to bring it back to the ordinance because I think it's really important to spend our time talking about this local ordinance.
And we have some questions, so as soon as you're
And again, what it does and what it doesn't
questions.
do, just want to remind people, does not affect in any way, open any floodgates, doesn't change immigration law, although they do need to be changed. I will agree with that. It doesn't change that at all. It doesn't change enforcement. But let's talk about who's affected, because it's not just people who are here without immigration status. There are 16.6 million people in the United States living in what's called a mixed status family. That means that in that family, one member or maybe more are unauthorized immigrants, and others are U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents. In Colorado, 5% of people live in a household with someone who is an unauthorized immigrant. So when we talk about ripping people out of our community, whether it's 11 million, 12 million, or 15 million people, that's those are people who are fully integrated into our community. They have children here, they own businesses, they own homes, and you quite honestly cannot simply rip those people away because it leaves too big a hole in our community. You simply can't do it. And so what we're talking about is not talking about affecting immigration laws. That, of course, has to be dealt with. What we're talking about is people who are here, people who are homeowners, people who are parents, people who are living in our community, and we want them to be fully participating in the community. And that's really what this is about.
Okay, I have 2 questions from the audience, so we're going to go there first.
Hi, thank you. Kim, you just hit on something that I've been thinking about and you really haven't discussed, and that is economics. Fort Collins has, I think, like, what, 2.3% unemployment? Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering how many of those people, if they left Fort Collins or we kicked them out, how are we going to get people working in our community at jobs that we don't want to do?
And I think that, you know, I don't want to steer too off into the economic stuff, but I think it's important to think about, our neighbor Greeley is a good example. Everyone remembers the Swift raids, and in the Swift raids, they rounded up and deported over 350 Mexicans and Guatemalans. But it wasn't people living in Greeley who took those jobs. It was Somalian refugees.
And
so
wages went up on those jobs, too.
And so, again, immigrants, refugees, took the jobs in Greeley. I think it's a really good point that immigrants are very important to the economy. And in fact, the proposed budget at the federal level, which anticipates great economic growth, depends upon great immigration, because you can't have economic growth if you don't have that workforce.
Okay, Glenn, you wanted to add to this question.
Yeah, it's amazing that people always say, oh, we don't have enough workers. At the same time, when we're talking about gross income inequality, not a living wage, homeless, unaffordable housing, that somehow we would fear losing some labor in that by chance employers might have to raise wages to a living wage instead of having to legislate it. Like, supply and demand actually works, people. And when we have a supply of illegal immigrants and more will be attracted, I don't believe for a moment that if we pass this ordinance that more people wouldn't come here, because it's like, hey, I'm all in, they don't even enforce the law. We have landscapers, we have lawn services, people in construction, people doing roofs, a lot of low-skilled people, youth, that can't make a decent wage. And a lot of them can't even get summer jobs. And yet at the same time, we say we need to have, we use that as a reason to allow, and I call it aid and abet illegal immigration. It just doesn't make sense. We have all those problems in this town, homelessness, low wages, unaffordable housing, and we want to pass an ordinance that would attract more people to come here and make us more crowded and more unaffordable. It just doesn't make sense.
Okay, Ernesto, then Phil.
This is nonsense. I mean, here we have the classic strategy of blaming the victim. When was the last time that immigrants cut their own checks? Okay? I mean, if anything, you should be pointing the finger at employers. They are the ones that offer them wages. Okay? So, I mean, here again, we have a very mean-spirited attack on those that are the most vulnerable in our communities.
Have you been down to try to get E-Verify passed by your legislature, which I have done for 5 or 6 times to make sure employers do hire legal immigrants?
How is that the immigrants' fault? Again, you should be blaming your government,
but why don't you?
But not the immigrants. You're blaming the victim again.
I'm not blaming the victim. I'm just saying supply and demand works, and it hurts a lot of Americans and a lot of legal immigrants while you're trying to protect the illegal immigrants.
Okay, Phil?
Just a quick
We're
point.
going to go to another question.
We had a comment, part of the comment used that phrase, jobs Americans won't do. And that just really sticks in my craw. What that means is jobs that I can't imagine myself doing or my kids doing. But your fellow citizens are doing those jobs. Only 1/3 of Americans get a college degree. Maybe construction isn't a job that you would do, but 75% of construction workers in this country are native-born Americans. Maybe janitorial work isn't a job that you would do, but your fellow citizens are doing it. And it's not an accident that those sectors of the economy like construction, janitorial services, working in restaurants, etc., are absolutely flooded with immigrants, immigrant workers, and lawyers and business managers have much lower immigrant percentage participation. So it's just one more way that our politicians are not sticking up for American workers.
Okay, let's go back to the questions.
This question is for Kim. Glenn Colton stated that all immigrants are here as a result of their own volition or free will. I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the factors outside of immigrants' control that may have driven them to immigrate to the United States.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I would actually disagree with that. I think that volition has very little to do with it. And I remember a conversation that I had with a friend some time ago, and I was sort of outraged because someone in his family had come to the United States and left a child behind. And I thought, well, how could you leave your baby behind? My children were little, and I was feeling like a strong mothering instinct. And my friend turned to me and said, you will never worry about your child starving to death. And I said, you're right. I won't. And so I think when we talk about volition, I think that, in my experience, that is simply not true. There are things that push people out of their country. Some of my clients are children who clung to the top of a train car and came into this country themselves, children as young as 8 years old who traveled across Mexico to get to this country because their life was in danger. People come here because they are pushed out of their countries, and sometimes they're pushed out of their countries because of violence. Sometimes they're pushed out of their countries because of economic policies of the United States that devastated their local economies. Sometimes they're pushed out of their countries because of political policies of the United States, because of U.S.-sponsored and U.S.-aided wars in Central America. And sometimes they're pulled into the United States. But I think volition has very little to do with it. And in fact, most of us would prefer to be in our community, to be in our culture. And people who make the very difficult decision to leave their community and leave their culture, when they do that, they have to think about a lot of things. And the thing that they don't think about is whether a local ordinance will allow them to report crimes. That doesn't come into the equation when they make that really, really difficult decision. And one of the volunteers with Fuerza Latina, who's a group I work with, said, you know, the most difficult part of this was making the decision to leave. People suffer greatly being away from their families, away from their culture, but they shouldn't suffer because we are mean to them. They shouldn't suffer because they're afraid. And I think we need to look around and we have to ask ourselves, what kind of community they want to be? I personally don't want to be in a community where the classmates of my child are living in terror that when they come home, mommy or daddy won't be there. That's not the community I want to live in, and that's what this ordinance is about.
The community that you want to live in is a community where you pick and choose which laws you're going to follow. I mean, you know, I know businessmen who think environmental laws are a drag, and they do everything they can to avoid it. You know, I'm not thrilled about paying sales tax. Maybe I should, you know, see if I can find ways to get around that.
Okay, let's vote.
Can I just make one more point, though? I want to note.
I have more questions, too.
I want to note that this was a lawyer talking about a large group of people, most of whom are not children, most of whom have knowingly broken the law. And she was saying, look, volition has nothing to do with it. I mean, there are all these forces. These people didn't choose to break the law. I mean, ask yourself, what's wrong with this picture?
Okay, I have more. I think this is important because these questions are coming from the community that inevitably will communicate with City Council and help them make a decision on what the community wants. Thank you.
Thank you for taking my question. This question is for Kim. I heard Phil say that breaking the law, that's what this ordinance is about. I then heard Glenn say that this ordinance is about the police not being able to do their job and that they couldn't arrest a rapist or a kidnapper or something like that. Kim, I'm confused. Could you explain? Because my understanding of the ordinance was all about that the police still do their job. They just don't take on the federal immigration job. They still enforce the laws on the books as far as crimes and public safety, but they don't get in the situation where they're racial profiling and they see a guy with dark skin and say, "Can I see your papers?" I thought that's what this was about.
Absolutely. And one of the things about community trust ordinances, and for those who are interested, you can just Google community trust and find out kind of what they're about. But one of the strongest pieces of a community trust ordinance is that it really makes possible community policing. And at this point in Fort Collins, we are not able to do community policing. Community policing is when the police and the community work together. It's just what it sounds like. And we're not able to do that right now because a good segment of our community is afraid to work with law enforcement. So it's not about actually protecting people, it's about strengthening the community's ability to work together with the police. That's really what the ordinance was about. And I also want to point out that we haven't really talked about this, but the word sanctuary policy floats around.
Thank you. That was next on my list.
And sanctuary, actually, there's no legal definition of sanctuary. Sanctuary, the idea of sanctuary policy actually came out of the 1980s when some churches faith organizations were providing sanctuary to people in the United States. And then I believe San Francisco probably adopted that sort of in solidarity with that faith-based sanctuary movement. But in fact, the ordinances that communities are passing are not sanctuary, they are community trust ordinances.
Well, I mean, we're constantly being told exactly how to talk about this. They're not undocumented, they're not illegal aliens. You have to use the phrase undocumented. Some people on your side of this issue like the word sanctuary, others don't. I would just point out, you know, when you have to be talking to your fellow citizens and policing exactly the way they can talk about this issue, maybe you're not being completely honest with them. I mean, as I read through this ordinance, I'm really struck by how different it is, this proposed ordinance, compared to the existing ordinances banning housing and employment discrimination. Those are very straightforward, they're understandable, and they articulate values that we broadly believe in. In this ordinance, we have Section B says, no city employee shall inquire into immigration status, et cetera, but Section H1 says, notwithstanding these prohibitions, city employees can do that. So, I mean, there's a reason why this is so convoluted. It's because there's no honest way to stand in front of your fellow citizens and say, we want to set up a right for people to be illegal immigrants.
If I may.
It won't fly.
If I may, Mary.
Okay, then I have another question.
Great, I just want to get back to, and this was the end of my comment, but it fits nicely with what Phil was saying, which is that in drafting this ordinance, we worked with experts at this in the state of Colorado and nationally, from coast to coast, looking at this ordinance and making absolutely sure that it would not conflict with state or federal law, and that it would not subject the city of Fort Collins to any sorts of sanctions. And so it's been very carefully crafted so that we can do what we want to do, which is build trust, encourage community policing without placing the city in any sort of jeopardy. And the city attorney's office is looking at that as well. I
spent several hours the other night watching a debate in Rockville, Maryland, and one of the key issues that they raised that they had to address, and they did a lot of research on this, was would this put any federal monies that the city receives in jeopardy because of this whatever?
And the answer is no.
And the answer is, it could. It would depend on how it gets litigated. And look, nowhere in this ordinance... I think
it's a valid question to ask because people have to know.
Nowhere does the ordinance say that enforcing immigration laws is a legitimate function of government. Doesn't say that anywhere in here.
It's not a local government function. The city of Fort Collins
it can be a local function.
It can be.
So,
that's a whole nother debate. That's a whole nother
This thing
again.
precludes the city from entering into agreements with the government to have local employment or legal authorities cooperate with federal government. And maybe that's an area we should be addressing as a city. Maybe we should be pursuing that.
And that's what I said. That is.
If we're looking at this, we need to look at the other side.
That is a debate that perhaps should happen in this city.
And please, every time a question goes to Kim, she gets more time and we get less time.
I'm trying. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question from the audience, and then, if you don't mind, I'd like each of you to take a minute and a half to kind of make a final statement on the issue.
I have a couple of questions. how are you going to stop employers from hiring cheap labor? I see it in my way to Greeley in the oil fields. I talk to the workers, and we know that the oil industry is not welcome for some. And they are the first ones to hire cheap labor. How are you going to stop them? Go to the mountains, that's one question. And the second question, and I apologize here to the entire audience. We all are illegal. Did you know that the CSU works in land? The land of CSU was stolen land. The US government broke every single treaty with my ancestors, the Native Americans. So you too are illegal.
Okay.
Could I just jump in here?
No, we really are very close on time, so you can have about 15 seconds.
Okay, I mean, in terms of what are we going to do about cheap labor, let's tighten up labor markets. Let's decrease legal immigration into the country. That would help. There's a good bill before Congress to mandate the use of E-Verify for all new federal hires, and that would cut way back on people hiring illegal immigrants. So let's get wage markets working for workers instead of against them. That would be my suggestion.
Yep.
Yeah, one thing we should do is have mandatory E-Verify for all employers. That would help ensure that everyone they hire is legal, yet there's been a lot of resistance to that. But that would help with the employment situation.
Resistance by employers, yes. Okay, thank you very much for your time. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is a very complicated and can be a very emotional discussion. So let's start with Glenn, and we'll come around the table, and I'm really going to give you about 2 minutes each to wrap up how you feel about this ordinance and what question, particularly I'd like you to focus on if someone wants to contact a city council person about this, what questions should they be asking their city council person?
I do want to remind the audience that something almost identical to this was brought forward about 12 years ago. And
yes, in 2005.
Was not passed by the city council. So this is the second time around it. Arguments haven't changed. I think the vast majority of people look at this are like me, and they're going, is this Alice in Wonderland where we legalize and we protect those who are here illegally from the consequences of their action while potentially punishing any city employee who may dare to ask and tying the hands of city employees who may dare ask immigration status? I mean, it's just all backwards. And the average person I talk to, they shake their head at this. They're like, what are you doing? What are they trying to do with, whether you call it a human rights protection ordinance or a trust? People I know, they won't feel like there's any trust coming out of, hey, don't enforce immigration law. Or they won't feel safer either. So I know a lot of people here, they're all about protecting that community, but in the broader community, most people are just saying, we do have a rule of law, and we shouldn't put city employees in a tough spot of where they could be prosecuted. I don't even know what the penalty for this is, but it's just absurd that you would put city employees at risk for this and preclude doing Section 287G if we have a real gang problem or something. So I just, I don't think this is going to fly with the general community. And again, tell me, how is this not a sanctuary city policy? How would this not attract more people? And again, push down wages, push up, make housing unaffordable, ramp up more growth, and how would it help the homeless?
Okay,
I mean,
thank you.
It would create more homeless like it is in LA, by the way.
That's good questions for people to ask their council. Kim.
I think we've gone over the fact that this does not change immigration laws or the number of people coming here. We're talking about people who are here. And we have a real problem in our community right now. I think we are in our community at the point of a social crisis. And a lot of us think, well, I don't know any undocumented people. Like, this doesn't affect me. But that's completely untrue. I would say that everyone in this room and everyone watching this show knows someone who is an unauthorized immigrant in Fort Collins. You may not know that, and they may not be brown-skinned and speak Spanish, but everyone here knows someone who is an unauthorized immigrant, and those people are living in fear. And I think we have a problem in our community when people are not reporting crimes, when they're victims of crimes, when people are not reporting crimes, when they're witnesses to crimes. We have a problem when our nonprofits are scrambling to deal with childhood trauma, because children are so traumatized, not just by the fear that their parents won't make it home, but by the bullying and taunting and hateful rhetoric that's going on in our community and our schools. So we have a problem here. And I guess the question is, what can we do about it? The answer is we can pass this ordinance. We can send a very clear message from the city leaders to the community that we want everybody to feel safe. We want everybody to participate in our community. And the question was asked, can you legislate trust? We legislate things like trust all the time. Civil rights legislation, human rights legislation, the Voting Rights Act, Title IX, all of those are legislating a type of behavior. And laws are a reflection of who we are as a society and help shape who we are as a society.
Thank you,
and it's a
Kim.
time for us
to move
for
on.
the ordinance. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Phil?
Yeah, I guess I agree with Kim that we've got a crisis in our community. Could you turn on your mic? Oh, sorry. I agree with Kim that we've got a crisis in our community. I see a different kind of crisis. I think we've got a crisis of growing economic inequality. And progressives, among whom I count myself, have basically failed in recent decades to stem that problem. And, you were asking, what should concerned citizens ask their city council person? They might ask them, what have you done in your time on city council to help working class Fort Collins residents live better lives? How come we don't have a higher minimum wage in Fort Collins, for instance? How come progressives don't get behind that? Instead, we get these sorts of things, which it's a proposal basically to drive down wages for poor Fort Collins residents and to give more employment to immigration lawyers. It's a proposal that would weaken and decrease community trust by undermining a shared commitment to respecting and following democratically enacted laws. So I think we should think pretty hard, especially those of us who are concerned progressives, about how do we get on a better path to create a more egalitarian society. And here's a hint.
Okay.
We're probably not going to get the message on how to do that by importing a lot of people from Latin America who are fleeing unequal societies.
Okay, thank you. Ernesto?
So somehow this ordinance has been turned on its head and framed in a way that it's something to protect the undocumented. Actually, it's a lot more than that. It's about not only protecting the undocumented, it's about protecting families, it's about protecting the community at large. Okay? I want to finish by quoting, paraphrasing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, an injustice to one is an injustice to all. So essentially, this ordinance is a reflection of our community values. How we treat the most vulnerable in our community says a lot about our values. What kind of values do we want to show to the world? What kind of face do we want to show to the rest of the world as Fort Collins? Is this going to be a humane face, or is this going to be a mean-spirited community? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time tonight. Thank you to our panelists and to our studio audience. The League of Women Voters encourages everyone to become informed and involved on this issue. Whatever the solution, it must be solved through cooperation from a wide range of constituents. Whether the right solution is public policy or private action, your questions and thoughtful investigation can help ensure a positive, long-standing solution. An informed citizenry is the cornerstone of democracy. This CrossCurrents program will be rebroadcast at various times during the month on FCTV, channels 14 and 881. Please check your local listing for exact times and dates. The video is available at the League of Women Voters website at lwvlarimercounty.org and on the city website at fcgov.com/FCTV under featured videos. Be informed and join the discussion. Thank you very much to our audience and our panelists.